All right, let's get started. Thank you all for joining our webinar this morning. This webinar is called How to Support People of Color in the Workplace. This is a very timely topic, and we're very excited to have you here with us today. My name is Victoria Hendrickson. I'm from OrgVitality, and in just a moment, I'll be handing you over to your presenter for today. Before I do that, just want to cover a couple of housekeeping items here. The first thing is you are all placed on mute for the presentation. We have about 30 minutes, and Sertrice has a lot of great content to get through. So she'll be leading through those 30 minutes. If you do have questions, we hope to have time to answer those questions live at the end. So please do enter those into the chat box or the Q&A box of the Zoom. And of course, if we do have time at the end, Sertrice will go through those. If we don't have time, we will still get back to you via email. So please don't let time be a barrier. Do put in any questions you have. And then the other piece to note there is that Sertrice will follow up with each of you personally. She'll make sure that each of you get the slides today as well as a recording. So no worries on taking detailed notes or anything. Please sit back and take in the content. A lot of this is really important, valuable stuff that you'll all want to soak in. So we'll get all those slides and details to you shortly after the webinar. Last piece here, of course, we're a survey company, so we're going to send you a survey at the end of the webinar. So please do take a few moments to respond to that survey. Your feedback really helps us shape our webinar content and shape our calendar of things to come. So with all of that said, I'm very excited to hand this over to Sertrice. She is really an enthusiastic expert in this space. I always learn so much from her, and I'm excited for all of you to learn from her today. So Sertrice, take us away.
Thanks, Victoria, and welcome everyone. My name is Sertrice Grice, and I am a consultant at OrgVitality. I have my master's in industrial organizational psych, and one of my research focuses is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as a Black woman, this topic is something that hits close to home, but it's also something that I'm passionate about in my professional work. Today, in honor of Black History Month, and based on my personal experience, we will be focusing on how to support Black people in the workplace. However, many of these tips can be adjusted for other groups as well. That being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So after the tragic George Floyd murder in 2020, the one silver lining I held on to was how society exploded with meaningful conversations around race in America. Something about this event felt different, and people were really responding. They were taking the time to do their own internal reflections and research, having meaningful conversations in their personal lives with people who look like them and people who don't. And we also saw an increased focus on DEI in organizations. With our clients, we saw an increase in questions around how to best address racism in the workplace. And my number one suggestion is always to utilize your metrics. Many well-meaning companies make the mistake of diving right in and making a statement against racism, scheduling allyship trainings or anti-racism trainings, and assuming that's all it takes without actually pausing to find what parts of their system or culture is actually broken. I always recommend for a company to slow down and truly consider the best course forward to ensure they can move from performative acts of inclusion to transformative. And metrics are a necessary tool when trying to enact this meaningful change. When considering metrics, one part of that is analyzing the data you likely already have in your systems. What are your selection rates, promotions, development opportunities, turnover? But a key data point that is often missing is actually hearing directly from your Black employees how they are experiencing life in your company. This data can be gathered through employee surveys or exit interviews. And now when I say address it on your surveys, I don't mean in the traditional passive way. For example, individuals are promoted fairly at my organization, or the rules apply equally to everyone. These items do have use when you break them down by demographic. However, it is also crucial to include direct items if you truly want insight into what they're experiencing. For example, asking items such as, my manager would take a stand if someone made a racially biased joke or slur, or our company is authentically addressing racial injustice in the community. Using direct questions like these and going beyond simply looking at items by demographic, but using advanced analyses such as decision trees, discriminant analyses, and network analyses will help you target specific actionable goals to address race in your organization. In the past, organizations have been hesitant to ask such direct questions in their employee surveys, usually on account of potential legal ramifications. And don't get me wrong, not all organizations are ready for this kind of work. Asking these direct questions will require buy-in from senior leadership, and leadership must be prepared to follow through on any systemic issues they discover through analysis of results. However, I have hope. Over 2020, we saw a decrease in organizations centering themselves in that fear of consequences mindset and an increased focus on the morality of addressing systemic racism. Many are accepting that it's just the right thing to do. And if there's work to be done, it needs to happen now. Now, let's say you've done your due diligence, studied your metrics, and established that you are having issues around inclusion in your organization. This may present itself in a few ways. If opportunities aren't being shared equally, if your Black employees feel their voices aren't being heard, or if they feel leadership isn't truly committed to DEI and they're just providing lip service. If these kinds of issues are appearing in your organization, then focusing on allyship is something that could be of use. If you've been listening in on conversations around allyship, you've likely heard two other popular terms for allies as well, accomplice or co-conspirator. And the thought here is that when a white person uses the term ally, they may be falling into that white savior narrative, claiming that they're an ally, but not necessarily following through with action. And the idea behind using terms like accomplice or co-conspirator is to imply that they are working with their Black colleagues to promote change. So semantics aside, what is the key behind allyship? And my favorite definition of allyship that I've heard comes from Victoria Mattingly of Mattingly Solutions. And she says, allyship is a dyadic relationship between an ally and their partner, working together toward the shared goal of fairness, equity, and social justice. So let's break this definition down. First, it highlights that allyship is a dyadic relationship. As I said, for white people navigating the allyship space, it can be tough to find that line between being a supportive ally and crossing into that savior role, right? So looking at it as a relationship or partnership between you, the ally, and your Black partner is something that will help keep the focus on the cause and away from having your efforts be self-serving. Now let's focus on the second piece, working towards fairness, equity, and social justice. This piece helps address the fact that allyship isn't a box you can simply check. You have to follow through with action to have a real impact. You know, inclusion, it's not a destination, it's a journey. And that road may change as you go. If you think of what it meant to be inclusive 50, 20, even 5 years ago, there would be some similarities, but there are definitely some major differences as well. So being an ally is something that you will need to continually and intentionally work on. This is especially important in the workplace. It is not enough for employees to complete an allyship training and then give themselves the title of ally and think things are fine and dandy. Being an ally means using your power and status to support and advocate for your Black colleagues. And it's important to note that ally is not a title you can give yourself. Only a partner can truly label someone as an ally. But the actions you take will definitely help you earn that label. When thinking of actions white allies can take for their Black colleagues, I like to think of it in two buckets, big action and little action. And when people think of allyship, they tend to think of things I would put under the big action category. This is going to be things that require you to be in a decision-making position of power. For example, leaders who oversee your company's selection processes need to keep inclusion in mind when recruiting and selecting. If you're a manager and you have opportunities in your department, being sure that you're not always going to the same person and you're giving others a chance. And last here is partnering with Black external groups. This could come in a few forms, whether that's adding more Black external vendors or sponsoring and donating to Black nonprofits. On the other side, there's also little action. And by little, in no way do I mean less important. This is action that is more on a personal level and often less visible. For instance, focusing on your own personal development. You have questions about how Black people experience the world? Don't understand why your Black colleague is reacting negatively to something? Do the research. Google is a wonderful place. There's also a plethora of books, movies, podcasts, documentaries, and more that you can use as a resource. Another key piece is simply developing relationships with Black colleagues. We established that allyship is a relationship between an ally and a partner. So by default, that means you cannot be an ally without building strong relationships with Black colleagues as a first step. Ask them about their work and their goals. Provide them with opportunities they may not be aware of. Really work at making a true connection. Part of your relationship will likely include having some tough conversations. Discussing race can be really uncomfortable, but as I like to say, we must become comfortable with the uncomfortable if we want to see things progress. Oftentimes, white people were raised to avoid the topic of race, and in many places, the norm is to avoid discussing race at work. But learning and progress can only happen through open and honest conversations. So when I say be open to tough conversations, I'm referring to being able to truly listen and hear your Black colleagues if they tell you that something you did was offensive. Having cultural humility is key in the allyship space. Being able to say, hey, I know I don't know everything, but I'm willing to learn and try and do better. But one perhaps obvious mistake to avoid is getting defensive. But another mistake to avoid is actually over apologizing and centering yourself in the situation. Instead, simply acknowledge what they shared. If you need further insight, ask 1 to 2 meaningful follow-up questions on how to do better, then take the advice as a learning opportunity and move on. Over apologizing can add extra emotional strain on your colleague to where now, on top of managing the negative emotions they're already experiencing, there's pressure to help you navigate yours as well, which is an unfair situation to put them in. It's also important that you're willing to stand up for your partner. For example, if you hear someone make a racist joke, call it out right then and there. Don't ignore it. Don't wait and address it in private. Part of the reason is to show your partner that you have their back in every situation. But the perhaps larger implication is that you are helping establish a culture where racial bias is not accepted. It is key that the pressure to correct white people is not only on your Black employees. If only Black employees speak up, it will continue to be viewed as a Black problem instead of a company culture problem. White people must have a role in publicly correcting racist behavior and holding others accountable for their actions. It will take courage at first because it's likely going against everything you've been taught, but the goal is to make this a cultural norm. And as with changing any norm, someone has to lead the way. So as of right now, we've talked a fair amount about what white people need to do to support their Black colleagues. But often in this space, we forget to discuss what Black people can do. Again, as a Black employee, you're a partner in this, so you definitely have a role to play. And not everyone agrees with this idea. And that's because many Black people are exhausted. They're tired from the injustice in society, tired of having to validate their existence, and tired of having to explain themselves in Black culture to white people. If someone is exhausted and feeling defeated, shutting down is understandable. It can be easy to say, I'm done explaining my feelings, or you made this mess, go clean it up. But that is doing yourself and your company a disservice. I heard a quote recently where someone said, I spent my life living to make white people comfortable. No more. I felt that was really powerful and it resonated with me. But what does that mean for Black people in the workplace? Let's look at the second part of that definition of allyship again. Working together toward the goal of fairness, equity, and social justice. We as Black people cannot leave it to white people to fight our fight. They have not lived our experiences and therefore cannot know what we need changed in the system. The goal in dismantling systemic racism is to achieve fairness and equity. We want to elevate Black voices. And to achieve this change, it has to be supported from the people in power. And as we know, the people in power are often white. So partnering with them is the only way to achieve this goal. But I want to be clear, your role is not to be the Black encyclopedia to the white people in your life. As I said earlier, they have Google for that. What I do encourage is for you to be open and vulnerable while being protective of your mental health. While the idea of real talk is prominent within the Black community, it hasn't always been transferred to how we communicate with people outside our race, especially in the workplace. Many of us are taught to smile and nod to avoid being seen as angry or violent and for fear of retaliation. However, we must work against this reflex. It's important to be able to have honest, meaningful dialogue with white people on the subject of race, even in the workplace. If you know your lived experience is causing you to be impacted differently by something at work, it's important to be able to articulate that to your white colleagues and work with them on potential solutions. This includes being honest and acknowledging discrimination when you see or experience it, big or small. No more living to make white people comfortable, right? But most importantly, take care of your mental health. These conversations are taxing. If you ever feel like you're in a conversation where it's too much, don't hesitate to excuse yourself. Or if you find you're constantly being called in for your Black perspective in diversity conversations and you're getting burnt out, turn them down and encourage a colleague to take your place instead. It is not your sole responsibility to constantly carry the torch and fix systemic racism on your own. No one person can accomplish this task. We are all in this together, and it is okay to take a break from the fight when you need it. Now, one final question that I hear that I wanted to address today is, how do we know if our allyship efforts are working? And not surprisingly, that answer is still use your metrics. Again, inclusivity is not a destination, it's a journey. It's important to continuously check your systems to see if the efforts you initiate are having the desired effect. If not, scrap it and try something different, or else you're still stuck in that performative space. So before we close today and move to the Q&A session, I wanted to leave you all with a call to action. First, as an organization, you should acknowledge that systemic racism exists and that your organization is being impacted right now by implicit and/or explicit bias. Again, that buy-in from senior leadership at the top is critical, and establishing anti-racism as an expectation in your culture and being able to make change in this space. A tangible action you can start now is reviewing your metrics and looking for those areas of concern. And remember, the efforts here have to be intentional. If you're looking for a place to start, we do have a resource on our website with our free IND Pulse survey with some items that could get you started. And finally, do the personal work that we've been talking about. Do your research, attend those company DEI events, and be an avenue of support for your Black colleagues. I've left a few example resources here at the bottom for anyone beginning their journey in the allyship space, looking for somewhere to start. There are also a few additional slides here for some movies, books, podcasts, and movements that you can look into supporting as well if you're looking for a starting point. That being said, that's all I officially have for us today. We're gonna move into that Q&A session. I'm gonna rely on Victoria to come back in now and help me see where we are there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sertrice. This is really valuable stuff, and we are starting to get a lot of questions. So as I start to read off the first few here, just want to encourage those who haven't yet had a chance to put their questions in the black box to please do so. We do have 10 minutes, so we'd love to cover as many of those questions as we can. The first, Sertrice, is perhaps connecting to your survey experience. So folks are asking what trends you're seeing in the data around DEI items.
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically when there are items related more to safety, so that item, my manager stands up if racial jokes are made, or, there's usually an item around, I know how to report discrimination. Those tend to be on the higher end across the board. Then when we move into those career opportunities, so promotions, hiring, development opportunities, we start to see those decline. And then those items related to leadership being authentic in their commitment to racial justice, those are even lower. And when we break the career opportunities and leadership down by demographic, we see that decline even more, especially for Black employees specifically. So those are the kinds of trends we've been seeing for clients who have used these types of items.
Great. And before I move on to the next question, there are people asking about the resources Sertrice has just shared. I do want to confirm we are going to be sending out the slides that'll include all of the resources pulled together and mentioned here. So those will be coming your way. The next item to move on to here is about different groups. So we've been talking a lot about Black and white today. There's a question here about, can non-white people be allies?
Yes, another great question. So as I mentioned earlier, just in honor of Black History Month, taking a traditional look at race in America, usually we hear, the white and Black conversation. However, we can all be allies at some point, because if you think back to that definition, it's about working with that partner towards equity and justice and fairness for them. And it's about having power. So if you're in a scenario where you have more power than someone else, you definitely can be an ally for them and help them through a situation. One example I want to throw out there right now that is top of mind and very relevant to our current environment is the Asian American community. Hate crimes in America have increased substantially since COVID began. And this is definitely a space where we all, the Black community, can come together and be an ally to them and support them through the things they're experiencing right now. It's definitely a space we should all be aware of. So all of that to say, yes, definitely, while the focus today was white and Black, anyone can be an ally as long as you have power and you're willing to use it to support that partner.
That really ties into our next question here, and the role of leaders and what they're doing to signal the importance. The question here is, what are the key leadership behaviors that signal to employees that inclusion is being recognized as important?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. The biggest one is going to be modeling those behaviors. So if you're expecting your employees to be comfortable talking about race, then having them be comfortable talking about race. Making a statement in the beginning that, yes, DEI is important, right? And we're going to focus on anti-racism. If that's going to be important, okay, establish it. Make it known throughout your organization that it's important. But then following up with actions and touching in on that periodically to say, hey, here are the actions we're taking to look into our bias in this way or in that way. So two different things there. One is modeling the behaviors that they want seen. And then the other piece is that transparency around what are they actually doing to address racial injustice at the organization.
Another question about inclusion is, how do you truly measure inclusion?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? When it comes to diversity, it can be really easy to sit back and measure the numbers, right? So you go by default. A lot of times people will think your selection pool. So what do our pool of candidates? What does that look like? What does it look like once we're hiring, and so on? But when you're thinking about inclusion, that's a bit more subjective, right? So these employee surveys are really useful in that, because you can ask questions such as, I feel accepted for who I am at the organization, or I can be my true authentic self. So you can really get their perspective. You can also follow up with focus groups to dive into that deeper. But then there's also ways you can look at the data. So when I mentioned those network analyses, looking around and seeing, how are people interconnected in your organization? Are they branching out and talking to people who aren't just like them? So really looking into your data in those ways are productive ways to measure inclusion. It's not just looking at the numbers, but also including that subjective experience from the employees as well, which makes this a harder space to navigate, but not any less important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got 2 questions left, and I think we have just enough time for that. So,
Sure.
one person is asking about a larger phenomenon they're seeing out in the world, not limited to the workplace, but perhaps happening online. And so what they're talking about here is when white allies are trying to speak up in a discussion, perhaps about certain words or behaviors that could be racially offensive, and then people of color are weighing in that they're not offended or that they feel like white people are speaking on their behalf. So I think the question here is, how do you be a good ally without overstepping? Just generally, what's your take on this, and what's your advice to people who see this happening and wonder what's their role?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say definitely trying to be an ally and trying to speak up and support them is something we recommend and is useful. However, if you hear someone say, whoa, like maybe that's not right. Here's actually how it's viewed. It goes back to that culture of humility and saying, oh, this was something I thought was offensive, but if you're fine with it, understand, we can move on. So again, taking that as a learning experience. But I do also want to go back to this space can be very subjective. So odds are there are going to be some things that certain people find offensive and other people don't. You mentioned Twitter, so I do want to say, so when it comes to social media, it is very hard. So I honestly don't recommend trying to be a social media warrior and putting things out there in certain ways and correcting people in that space, because you don't necessarily know. But when it comes to people you're close to in your life or colleagues, we talked about building that relationship. Hopefully there you have some more context, so what may bother them, or you're able to have conversations with them. So I hesitate to say, it's not your role to fix the world, but focus on the people who are close to you, because then you'll have a better connection on, what is offensive to them, and being able to support them when those things occur.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like having good intentions and being, willing to learn from your mistakes is going to be important for allies.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Last one, burnout on DEI. Someone here is asking about what about folks getting burnt out on DEI, and how much is too much?
Yes. And we've seen this come up in a number of ways. And as I mentioned, 2020, we saw this explosion in this space in these conversations. And this ties back to why metrics are so important. It is easy to get burnt out on this. So, and DEI is broad. We talked about one tiny little sliver today, but there's so many other pieces that are important in having conversations as well. So using your metrics to figure out what you should be focusing on as a company will help reduce that load on your employees and on your leaders, right? Because again, your leaders need to buy into this. They then need to create actions around this to make things improve. So forcing them to do all of these different trainings or all of these different actions, it can easily become overwhelming. And the last thing we want is for employees to become apathetic. So it's important to determine your needs and then make targeted efforts. Not every conversation should always center around just race, but when data supports that race as a factor, being sure to highlight it in those conversations. So yeah, awesome. Thank you, Victoria, in helping me lead that Q&A and organize things. That is about time today. We're about out and I want to be respectful. So again, we will be sending a copy of the slides and the recording. I will be emailing each of you a copy of the slides and the recording. And I really appreciate you joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.